She is a psychologist here at Curry, and she does a phenomenal job. She told me to keep it short, but I want to give her the introduction she deserves. Okay, I'll keep it short. Basically, she does a phenomenal job of dealing with these kind of structural inequity, these structural forces that shape the ways youth engage with each other, youth understand each other. I actually use her syllabus as like my personal reading list. So she is going to come up here now, and this is a panel where two of the people are having to Skype in for it, so you will see them on video.
All right, good morning. So we have a very exciting panel this morning, and we have half are here, and half will be virtually connecting with us. Our panel will be focusing on the contemporary imperative for connecting moral reasoning, dialogue, and democracy. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and very briefly introduce all four of our panelists. Again, two will be joining us remotely. That way we can kind of facilitate a quick transition between each presentation. And the other thing I'm going to ask you to do is just jot down questions you may have while people are giving their presentations, because we're going to save all of the Q&A for the end. So we're going to have kind of a quick run through of all presentations, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. And because of the technological issue, I will have to repeat some of the questions that you all asked just for our panelists who weren't able to be here with us so that they can hear the question. So we'll work through it together, but if you don't mind, just as you have questions for any of the panelists, please just jot them down as they're presenting. So our first presenter is going to be Nicholas Burbules, who's a professor in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. His primary research areas are philosophy of education, teaching through dialogue, and technology in education. He is also an education director for the National Center on Professional and Research Ethics, which is also at the University of Illinois. Our next presenter, who again will be joining us from a distance, is Gabriel Velez, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership in the College of Education, and he's at Marquette University. He studies identity development, human rights, peace education, and restorative justice in educational contexts. He's collaborated with a number of organizations, both governmental, nonprofit, and also some in Colombia. Then here we have, luckily joining us in person, he got out right before the snowstorm, Shawn Brown, who's a lifelong Rochester resident dedicated to holding up the voice, leadership, and power of young people. Shawn has spent 6 years as Director of Teen Services and Anti-Gang Specialist at the Boys and Girls Clubs of Rochester, and he was recently promoted to Rochester Program Director for Teen Empowerment after 5 years of service. Congratulations. And last but certainly not least, we have Delilah Garvin, who's currently in her junior year at T.C. Williams High School. She's an honor roll student, a member of the AVID program, which stands for Advancement via Individual Determination. Ms. Garvin plans to study business management when she goes to college, and she wants to become an entrepreneur. She is also noted as a great collaborator. So that's our very exciting panel. Please join me in welcoming them. And we're going to kick it over to Nick.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is Nick Burbules from the University of Illinois. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Super. So I am one of those people who couldn't make it in. I'm very unhappy not to be there, but thank you to Leslie and everyone for setting this up so that I can share some comments with you virtually. I've written and published a lot on the topic of dialogue over the course of my career. It was the topic of my first book, and I've written a lot of things since then. I'm an advocate for the notion of dialogue in educational context and in other contexts, but I think that we have to be realistic about what we can expect from dialogue, and particularly what we can expect from dialogue under difficult circumstances and in contexts of conflict and disagreement that make, even with good intentions, dialogue difficult and sometimes there aren't always even good intentions. So this talk is some reflections. They're based on theoretical work, but it's not a theoretical presentation about what we can expect from dialogue. Next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the first things to talk about is that dialogue isn't just one thing. In my book, I talk about different types of dialogue and different forms of dialogue. But what I want to highlight here is that dialogue sometimes it can be used for very different kinds of purposes. Sometimes it's used for inquiry or for learning. If you know Plato's dialogues that involve Socrates engaging people in dialogue, those are often dialogues about inquiry. There's a question or a problem that people are trying to understand or think through together. Sometimes dialogue is about problem solving, a specific situation or problem that a group of people are dealing with, and the dialogue is about how to solve or deal with that complicated or difficult situation. Sometimes a dialogue is something more like a negotiation, where there's differences or disagreements between groups of people, and the dialogue is a way of trying to seek some kind of compromise that is at least minimally acceptable to all the participants. Sometimes dialogue is a way of trying to pursue agreement, where there are differences or disagreements, but the hope is that through dialogue, people will actually come to converge and share their views. In some ways, this is the most common view of dialogue. I think it is often an aspiration. Sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. But one of the themes across a lot of my work on dialogue is that sometimes we tend to over-romanticize dialogue. And we think that if we just keep engaging in dialogue with each other, eventually we'll have some kind of kumbaya moment where everybody holds hands and agrees and all of our differences and disagreements go away. Sometimes that's possible, often it's not possible. But that's not a reason not to engage in dialogue. It's just a reason to have different and more realistic expectations about what dialogue can accomplish. It does not always accomplish agreement. It does not always accomplish that kumbaya joining of views. Sometimes, in fact, even when it doesn't produce agreement or a sharing of views, dialogue can at least develop some degree of understanding or empathy across those differences or disagreements. We still disagree with each other, but now because we've heard each other's reasons and feelings and motivations and concerns, we at least understand where some of those differences and disagreements are coming from, and that's progress, even though the differences and disagreements don't always go away. Sometimes, in fact, in these dialogues, we might even be more aware of our differences and disagreements. The dialogue might actually produce a heightened sense of how far away from each other we actually are, but that too can have beneficial effects if it produces at least some kind of tolerance or understanding or empathy that those differences or disagreements aren't just good guys versus bad guys or us versus them, but one honest, seriously held set of views and values and another honest, seriously held set of views and values. That also, again, can be productive and beneficial in educational context and in other contexts, but again, it doesn't make those differences and disagreements go away. And finally, I think that to sort of wrap up this slide and this theme, that understanding and empathy sometimes reframes the way that we think about those differences. I'll talk about this later, but I think one of the concerns I have about social and political discourse in our society right now, especially I'll say at the national level, but in many other contexts as well, is that it is defined as the good guys versus bad guys, as us versus them. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes we really are fighting and struggling against injustices or other things that really have to be challenged and called out. But often, maybe more often than we realize, the other side of whatever disagreement really does have some principled reasons for their position, and we can come to understand theirs and they can come to understand ours, which at least changes the frame through which we look at or understand those differences and disagreements. Next slide, please. So one of the things that comes up in my work is that there's different kinds of dialogue, and you can see this typology mapping onto what I've just talked about. Some dialogues are pedagogical. They're about teaching and learning. We talk about, for example, the Socratic method as a dialogical form of pedagogy. The Socratic method, which actually we don't often see Socrates actually using in Plato's dialogues, but the sort of ideal of the Socratic method is one in which the teacher engages the student in a kind of pedagogical engagement through questions, through suggestions, through examples that helps the student to make active connections themselves, as opposed to the teacher telling them something or explaining something. If you're familiar with the work of Paulo Freire writes a lot about this notion of dialogue, this sort of notion of pedagogical dialogue, and he contrasts this idea of pedagogical dialogue with what he calls the banking system of education, where the teacher is depositing knowledge or information in the minds of the students. But dialogue takes other forms as well. It's not always pedagogical. Sometimes a dialogue is a conversation. We talk about dialogues with our friends or family members, which are not entirely pedagogical. They're about sharing ideas of information. Sometimes they're about sharing contrasting or conflicting views on topic, but it's about understanding, it's about friendship, it's about strengthening a broader sense of bonds through a communicative engagement where sharing, but even sharing sometimes differences and disagreements, can help to actually strengthen those bonds. As I said earlier, sometimes a dialogue is more like a negotiation. Sometimes a dialogue is more like a debate. There really are two or more different positions, and the dialogue is about running those positions and the arguments for them up against one another as vigorously as possible, with the idea, at least in the ideal, that the best argument will win. And this idea of dialogue as debate is one of the contexts in which the differences or disagreements might not go away, but by engaging these differences and disagreements, our own arguments and understandings are strengthened by being run up against counter arguments and counter positions, but also B, we do now understand the reasons and arguments behind another view and may come to see it, even though we don't share it, as at least coming from principled positions, as I said earlier. Sometimes, finally, and I'll talk more about this in a second, a dialogue is adversarial. It is speaking truth to power. It is a challenge to injustice or illegitimate authority. And in that case, it takes different forms. In each of these cases, the dialogue takes different forms. And I think if you're thinking along with me, you already can see a conversation looks and feels different than a debate. A negotiation looks and feels different than a classroom dialogue. The kinds of questions, the ways in which you say certain things, the tone with which you express yourself, all are going to vary in different ways depending on what kind of dialogue it is. And in an adversarial dialogue, the point isn't always to achieve understanding, it's to speak back, to speak out, to speak truth to power, as I said. And one of the interesting things I want you to think about is what happens often in dialogues is that there's sometimes a disagreement between the participants about what kind of dialogue it is. And because there's a disagreement and a failure to agree about even what the ground rules of the dialogue are, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the dialogue to be successful because the different participants are engaging the dialogue with different motivations and different attitudes about what the goal of the dialogue is. Your goal is to achieve understanding and compromise, perhaps. My goal is to speak truth to power. And that means that we're going to often talk past each other, not only in what we're saying, but also in terms of why we're there and what we think the dialogue is for. Next slide, please. And so another complicating factor, and this relates to the next 3 slides, about dealing with dialogue realistically, is understanding the specifics about the context in which the dialogue is happening. You have a professor there, Rachel Wall, who's really, really smart. I like her and I like her work a lot. She's written several articles and even a book on difficult dialogues. And she's looked empirically at context and situations, especially situations of vigorous disagreement and debate, to see what kind of dialogue is really possible on the ground in these real situations. One of her articles, in fact, everyone there knows what I'm talking about, takes place in the context of the aftermath of the protests and the really tragic events around the fight over Confederate statues there in Charlottesville. And she talks about two groups who clearly have very, very different views about this issue, trying to engage each other in dialogue. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. But these articles that Rachel Wall has written are rich with detail. These are real people really struggling to make dialogue work under sometimes very difficult contexts. So let me just run through quickly. This is the first of 3 slides. Things that we need to think about really and practically when we're trying to have a dialogue. Where are we having it? When are we having it? When do you have a dialogue around something like what happened in Charlottesville? When is it too soon? When is it too late? When is that time when maybe people are ready to have a conversation? Who's participating? What are their identities? What are their positions in terms of race or ethnicity in relation to each other? How do people speak? You know, academics versus non-academics, young people versus older people. The language changes, the discursive styles changes, even the vocabulary that people use can sometimes be somewhat opaque to one another. Their interests, their power positions, and the ways in which those often conflicting interest and power positions can conflict with each other. As I said earlier, what are their expectations about the kind of dialogue that they're having and why they're engaging in dialogue with each other? Those expectations may not actually be in alignment with each other, and that too can produce a certain kind of conflict. Not only the conflict about the topic, but a conflict about the kind of dialogue you're having and the kind of ground rules that are fair or appropriate to that kind of dialogue. How many times have you been in a situation of conflict where someone says, you can't ask me that question, or you can't talk to me that way? And one of the reasons why that sometimes happens is because they think the rules of the game are different than maybe other participants' rules of the game happen to be. A really great essay by Iris Young, a philosopher at the University of Chicago, talks about 2 different kinds of speech, which she calls deliberative speech, which is an attempt to kind of engage one another in order to work out a set of ideas or disagreements, versus what she calls political speech or activist speech, where you're speaking at someone or to someone or against someone. The prepositions here are really kind of interesting to reflect on, where I'm not trying to understand you and I'm not trying to reach an agreement with you. I'm here to tell you that I think you're wrong and here's why. Both of those kinds of speech can be appropriate in different kinds of contexts, but the problem arises when one group thinks it's one kind of dialogue and the other group thinks it's a different kind of dialogue. Next slide, please. Because there's a bunch of young people in the room, I have to say quickly, another aspect of context is the ways in which the technological context, or contexts plural, are also changing the forms and the possibilities of dialogue. In contexts like social media and other technologically mediated environments, the context itself starts to change the nature of the dialogue. And you all know more about this than I do. When you're limited to 140 characters, you say things in a different way than you do when you have a chance to engage each other in a more leisurely way. There's an aspect of engaging with people online that is somewhat context free. You often don't know who's at the other end of the wire or where they are or who they are. And you're sending messages and receiving messages that are maybe expressions of what you want to say, but you're not always aware of how those statements might land on someone else. In many contexts, one has or can have the protection of anonymity or a pseudonym, where you don't know who I am. And when I'm posting something, you all know my name here, but in another context, I might say something much more controversial if you knew that you didn't know who I was. And with that anonymity, I think sometimes comes a breakdown of responsibility and accountability for saying what one is saying with one's name attached, and in a situation where you're prepared to stand behind what you say. And I think we've all had experiences of anonymous posters or whatever who really abuse that by saying harsh or cruel or hurtful things because they don't have to take responsibility by putting their name on it. This also is reinforced by the more informal or impersonal tone of a lot of things. I post something on social media and send it out to 100 or 500 or 1,000 or in the case of one individual in this country, 35 million people. And I don't have to really think about who those people are because I'm just focused on saying what I want to say, regardless of who it hurts or harms or damages. In online context, it's also very important to be able to judge the source of where something is coming from. What's this person's qualifications? What's their position? What's their bias? What's their agenda? Especially in situations where we can't get that information from someone or about someone, it's not very clear to us. We have a hard time judging the content of what they say because we don't actually know enough about who they are and where they're coming from. And finally, and again, you all know this, there is often a certain kind of tone to online interactions. I was having, in fact, a big disagreement with some people the last couple of days over the weekend. I don't want to get into the substance of it, but at one point I just said, we can't do this by email because the temptation of typing that little snarky comment is just a little bit too overwhelming in online context. And you wouldn't usually say that to someone if you were saying it to them face to face, if you saw their expression when you say it. If you were engaged in a more verbal mode of interaction like we are now, and not just something that was impersonally text-based. And again, I think we all have experiences with this. Finally, last slide. And the third, I hate to end on bad news, but the third aspect that really concerns me is that we have in many ways an anti-dialogical society today for a variety of reasons. And everyone knows this. I'm just pointing out things we're all aware of and I'm sure we're all worried about. We have a much more polarized society today. I've talked about us-them dynamics. We have a lot of us-them dynamics, especially at the national level. Sometimes this is reinforced by positional or identity politics, conflicts between different racial or gender or ethnic or national or religious or other groups where the identification with myself, my identity, my group can sometimes make it hard to understand through certain filters or lenses other people's identity and their identification with a different position or group or culture, etc. I think another aspect of the Anti-Dialogical Society is an increased skepticism about truth or any conception of a common reality or a common good. This is, like, again, philosophical point about doubts about whether there even is an area of potential agreement when what does the famous say? Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Well, increasingly, we're seeing a national culture in which people feel like they are entitled to their own facts. And if each group, of whatever sort, politically or otherwise, feels like their factual reality is a different reference point than other people's factual reality, it makes dialogue much, much more difficult to pursue. And finally, just to end on this, all of these factors, I think, reinforce an us-them orientation, which is sometimes real. I've said it a couple times. Sometimes those conflicts and disagreements and fights are real, but often we bring an us-them mentality even to things where understanding, potential agreement, at least some degree of empathy and tolerance would be possible. And again, Rachel Wall's work really covers a lot of it, wonderful examples where this happens. Having said all this, I'm an advocate for dialogue. I believe in dialogue. I think we have to fight for dialogue. I don't know what we would replace dialogue with if we gave up on it as a society. But I think that in engaging dialogue, we have to be realistic about the problems, the limitations, the barriers, and the difficulties that we're going to encounter when we try to engage in dialogue with each other. Thanks very much, everyone.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. I love the response. Thank you from the audience, too. I apologize as well that I wasn't able to make it, and the weather was quite unfortunate, and I'm very thankful to Leslie and everyone for helping make this possible. And hopefully bear with us, but it went very smoothly, and I'm thinking it will. They've done a great job. My name is Gabriel Velez, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about some work I've done in Colombia and generally thinking about youth as peace builders in contexts like Colombia, where there's attempts to sort of transition in the broader sense in society from a history that's deeply rooted of conflict and violence to a future that is more peaceful. And to start, I would like to talk a little bit about peace education. So Leslie, if you can slide, thank you. Sorry, I've run through the agenda first. I'm going to talk about a little bit about peace education in youth, give a tiny intro into the Colombian context, but not do it any justice, and then talk a little bit about the work that I've actually done in some of the themes from this qualitative work, these interviews with adolescents across Colombia, and then try and sort of extend it more broadly in thinking about how we think about young people in these contexts and particularly as agents. So with that in mind, I'm going to start, as I mentioned, with talking about peace education. So the next slide here, it has a quote from, it's now a couple years old, I think it's from 2013, from Ban Ki-moon. And so in this quote, right, he's highlighting that there's a focus when we're talking about human rights and education, that we want to think about education as more than just conveying information. And there's this acknowledgement sort of across peace education and these kind of initiatives that we want to foster young people's development with this end goal in mind that he taps into at the end there about forging more just, inclusive, and peaceful societies. Right, so there's kind of the will behind it that we want to think about social justice, and peace education is sort of a tool and a means that we can maybe get there with a particular focus on young people. One of the issues, though, I think, and if we go to the next slide, laying out very sort of bare bones in a lot of traditional peace education and sort of some of these international organizations, there's the idea that you kind of have this context, which often includes violence, whether that be in the community, whether it be societal violence, or both, and that context is sort of determining young people's individual outcomes. And so there's often a deterministic viewpoint that the violence and conflict leads to these sort of negative outcomes for young people individually, and then that feeds into problematic societal outcomes. The idea then with this sort of traditional model is that we're providing those tools and skills there. So we're not necessarily changing the context, we're providing the tools and skills that will then change young people's individual outcomes. So in these same sort of contexts of violence, they're getting these tools to be peace builders, and then that's going to shape societal outcomes. And that'll sort of maybe inflect back on their context. But it's a framework that I think leaves out a real focus on how young people are thinking about these tools and skills. How are they receiving them? What are they doing with them? What are their own ways of responding to this context? And so I sort of would propose that we want to think about it in a little bit of a different model that's a more developmental focus. And so on the next slide, I lay out here, and this is borrowing from Margaret Beale Spencer's PVEST model, the idea that ecological contexts, and so these contexts of community or societal violence, are first interpreted by young people. And so they have a sense of who am I in this context, what's going on, how do I think about this? And that's shaping sort of their emerging ideas about the society and about certain tools in particular in relation to something like peace education, their own identities. And then those are sort of playing into individual outcomes, and these individual outcomes reflect back into the ecological context. And as you notice, sort of this model has arrows both ways because these are constantly sort of iterative and dynamic and bidirectional processes. And so, for instance, the way young people interpret that context is shaping the context itself too. And then their sort of identities are shaping how they're interpreting and kind of back and forth. And so this is something that I think I want to sort of think about how we think about peace education and education in these contexts of violence with a real focus on how are young people actually interpreting this and responding to this. And so the next slide, we're going to move into talking a little bit about kind of the context in Colombia where I've done this work, and then I'll sort of come back to that model at the end. Now, Colombia, as I mentioned in the next slide, I have just a couple images and one graph where the one on the left is showing the number of affected people in hundreds of thousands, and then the right is sort of breaking down in terms of the number of people who are victims and the ways they're affected. So the largest chunk being their displaced people. And the graph on the left shows that the violence of the armed conflict really peaked in the early 2000s. But sort of the takeaway from a lot of this is that violence in terms of armed conflict, because there's also community violence and violence related to illegal drug trade, but the armed conflict violence has been very extensive in Colombia and reaches far back in its history, at least to the 1950s. And you can trace it further back with other issues of colonialization and that as well. But it affects young people very broadly and in many different ways. And so there are many of them who are displaced people. There are many of them who've had family members who've been kidnapped or homicides, and there have been threats. And so this is something that has deeply marked Colombia's history and has marked its recent present as well. But there has been sort of a little bit of a shift recently. And so in the next slide, I sort of highlight that in 2012, and some of you may have heard about this, there was the beginning of peace talks between the government and the oldest and largest armed revolutionary group, which is the FARC there. And so they began these in 2012. And it took 4 years for them to come up with these 300-page documents, which you see there, the president and the head of the FARC holding up. And this was sort of a very extensive process. And so during these 4 years, they talked about many points. And one of the important sort of underlying themes of it was that they were sort of talking about, let's not just say that you're going to lay down arms and we're going to figure out how the state and this group are going to interact in a different way. But let's talk about how we can make Colombia a society that's more peaceful and make this broader. And one of the ways, which in the next slide, there's sort of a quote that illustrates this from the president who's in that other photo there. One of the ways that they were going to do this was a real focus on young people, in the sense of that young people are going to be these future peace builders. And so here's a quote where Juan Manuel Santos lays this out, talking about young people as leading the construction of peace, and the education system is going to provide them with the tools to do it. And so there was a peace education law where peace education was mandated in all levels of schooling. And that was something that the president was supporting and was in fact referring to here. But again, there's the same idea of, yes, that young people are gonna construct this peaceful future. We're giving them the tools and they just gotta do it. And that's what's, that's how it's gonna happen. And again, not really that emphasis or interest in, or attention, I should say, to how young people are receiving it. And I sort of love this image that came from one of the resources that developed out of that peace education law, where the young people just sort of have their books and their technology and have the banner and they're just kind of like leading the way, right? And they're happy and smiley. And there's all sorts of analysis you could do on that, the lack of diversity and all sorts of things. But just this idea that they're just going to take it and run with it. So this is sort of the context in which my research came about. And so that's what I'll talk about next. And in the first slide of the research, I kind of lay out the broader research question that I had, and this is tied to some of my dissertation work. And it's sort of this idea of how are young people, and particularly adolescents in Colombia, making meaning and forming civic identities within this context. So I was really interested in their identity development, and particularly in relation to citizenship, but how that tied to how they were understanding and thinking about the context of Colombia at the time. And so the peace process, but the peace education initiatives and the discourses about peace. And so I sort of had these three areas of research. And because of time, I'm going to focus on this first one, this sort of understandings of peace. How are they thinking about peace? And how is that, sort of, it's even a first step there. If we're talking about giving them these tools for peace, if we're talking about peace education, let's get to the basics of how are they even understanding it can happen. I also had research where I was sort of more focused on the identity part in relation to that, and then also how they're actually acting as peace builders. And so this was kind of the broader study. And then in the next slide, I have some of just to give you a quick sense and overview of the research I did. And so I did interviews with over 300 adolescents, and this was in 2016 and 2017. They were between 15 and 18 years old, and they were in 43 school sites across these 6 areas of the country. I do want to recognize that this is no way nationally representative, and in particular, there were populations from the indigenous populations that I wasn't able to sample from at all, and didn't have any of their sort of voice in the sample, although I was able to get some different groups of Afro-Colombian youth in there. But it was a very heavily urban sample as well. And so urban-rural dynamics are very important in the conflict in Colombia. And so I recognize that there's some of those kind of limitations, but it was kind of a broad sample and was across these different regions in Colombia. And so I used a thematic analysis, and I'm going to highlight 3 of the themes that came out of this work. And so the 3 themes that I want to highlight here, this first, that peace really begins in the individual. And so when they talked about it, they said, it situates here within me the ways I'm thinking about the world and the ways that I'm sort of, the ways that I'm orienting myself to the world. And so it's something very individual. And then you build peace through convivencia. And convivencia, I leave there in Spanish. It's one of these wonderful terms that really doesn't translate very well. It sort of basically is the idea of like getting along, interpersonal harmony, but it's very rich in Spanish, and it was used over and over again by these young people. And so the idea that it's rooted in the individual, but then it's building more broadly through the work that they're doing and through how they interact with people. And then this last theme I think that's important, though, is that peace sort of when they're talking about peace, they're talking about these different levels and contexts that really influence it and the experience of it. And I'll get into that more when I provide an example in a second. I'm going to walk through an example of each of these, but it's sort of the idea that there may be limits. And so particularly from this inward out focus, and then they're talking about where that can actually extend to and what might impact that. And so, as I mentioned, I want to lay out a few examples, and so I'll give one for each of these. And so for the first one about peace beginning in the individual, this comes from Jesus. And when he was defining peace, he was talking about peace has to develop from within. It is an understanding that you must tolerate others and act towards them as you would want them to act towards you. You must interiorize this, overcome your impulsivity, and always forgive. For me, peace is this idea that begins inside of you, and then you must act on it towards others. And so this is sort of interesting, and particularly if we think about in relation to something like neoliberal models, or the one that even the government was using, with this idea that there's sort of structural elements to peace. And so a lot of these young people were talking about, no, peace is about something internal, about the way I orient myself to the world, even sort of self-control there's mentioned. And then that is sort of enacted upon in interpersonal relations. And so the next theme touches kind of on that, on how it's built. And so this quote comes from Jennifer, and she talked about peace is living as a community in harmony and helping one another. It is not only thinking about yourself, which is what most often happens nowadays with Colombian citizens and the government. For me, peace is about living in communion, harmony, helping each other, working and living as a united country toward a unified future. And so here she's talking about, she's still this idea of, she's talking about other parts about it's you doing something, right? You helping other people, it's understanding this, that you're part of sort of a group and you're part of a community. And so that's how the piece is kind of built, with the individuals then acting in these ways within their local communities and contexts. Now, the last theme that I want to highlight is kind of more about the obstacles to that. And so this example comes from Daniela, and she's talking about whether or not she lives in peace, and says, with myself, yes, I live in peace, but outside issues affect me. So it's very difficult in some moments to live in peace, like seeing people fight or in violent conflict with two groups fighting. These things really impact me. And sort of what she's reflecting that more of these young people talked about is this idea that there are things happening externally, though, that limit this ability for them to build peace. And so this idea that it maybe starts internally, and then they're building it in community context, but that there's also sort of an outward influence. And so they're saying, well, if other people are fighting, I don't see how I can sort of maybe impact that. Or there were others who talked about, well, in my school, I can be a peace builder maybe, and with my friends, but then if I go out into the community and there are gangs and sort of neighborhood violence, well, that's the limit, and that's as far as I can go. And so they see sort of these limits on the impact that it can have, but also the ways that these contexts then in turn sort of impact their internal peace and impact that sort of seed and that beginning of how peace is built. So now sort of wrapping up and trying to sort of extend some of these connections. So one of the things, I think, connecting this back to how we think about promoting peace through youth. And so I mentioned in the Colombian context, I think there was a lot of will to be like, we want young people to be actors. We want them to build peace. But I think we have to think beyond sort of tools in education and some of what I laid out before. And one of the ways is to think about identity, and that identity matters. And so when they're rooting it in themselves and they're talking about these contexts, it matters how they understand themselves in relation to this, and particularly in terms of, for instance, self-efficacy. So what is their identity as a member of their community, and how might their impact their feeling of that they can actually be a peace builder, or even their feeling of peace if it's rooted in that individual and in themselves. And then the other one, which also speaks to these kind of contexts, is how can we link this sort of individual and local level focus to broader systems and challenges? And so there's some theory that's laid out in peace education that's a critical peace education, and it ties nicely because it draws heavily on Freire as well. But this idea that linking sort of this internal focus on peace and linking these actions in their immediate interpersonal context to a broader peace, and trying to help them show how they can fight and how they can work towards building peace in their communities and in the Colombian society, which often for them was a real challenge when they're seeing all these things in the media, or they're experiencing things out in their neighborhood, as I mentioned, like local level violence, things like gangs. And so how can we incorporate a critical peace education focus into how we're promoting youth's development as peace builders in contexts like Colombia? And so kind of as the broader takeaway in the next couple slides, this is another way to rethink that sort of framework that's often the case, I think, in these contexts that I laid out in the beginning. And it's, we think about young people and they're talked about in these contexts of violence like Colombia, and these are two photos from Colombia, either as sort of these possible perpetrators because of the violence they're experiencing and is around them, or as these victims, but then we're sort of intervening with these tools and skills, and that's going to lead to these societal outcomes. And so again, I think that what we really need to sort of promote and think about in my work is trying to sort of get at and highlight in the next slide is returning to that sort of more developmentally appropriate framework that involves an understanding of how is their interpretation, how is their experience and the sense that they're making of their world, their social world, connect to their identities, and then that feed into their outcomes and their ability to really help build and influence peace in their societies. So with that, I just want to have a couple thank yous to end to the fellow panelists and to UVA and the Curry School of Education, which one day I hope to get down there and see your lovely campus. But thank you for making this still possible. Also to my funders, and then lastly, I always think it's important when I present this work to highlight that I'm extrapolating and taking these words from the lives of adolescents, but to recognize that these are their lives and their experiences that they shared with me, and I'm very thankful for that. Thank you.
Good morning. Yeah, thank you. So my name's Shawn Brown. I'm from Teen Empowerment Rochester. And before I get into my presentation, I'm going to ask for a little participation for everyone in the room. We're going to do an interactive springboard, as we call them at Teen Empowerment, called Hands Together, where we're going to attempt to all clap together in unison. All right? Sounds good? Yeah. All right, cool. All right. So what's going to happen is that I'm going to kind of be the leader, and you all are going to take a note from me. And when I get to the middle to clap, we're going to try to all get there together. All right? So free your hands, laptops, cell phones, pens. All right, here we go. First attempt. You guys are a little slow. Let's try this again. Here we go. Well, that was pretty good. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I just wanted to do that to get it started, to acknowledge this space, everyone here, the meeting of the minds, give appreciation to Youth-Nex for their 10-year anniversary, and hope that the conversations and interactions that take place at this conference will be engaging, meaningful, and help us support young people further in all the places that we work and operate. So again, I'm Shawn Brown. I'm from Teen Empowerment Rochester. Teen Empowerment as a whole has been around for almost 27 years. We started down in Boston, but we've been in Rochester for about 16 years. And the big thing at Teen Empowerment, we hire young people ages 14 to 19 in the role of youth organizer. So it's a paid position. They make $12 an hour to look at the issues that young people face in their neighborhood and organize initiatives, events, and projects around those issues. So from year to year, those issues could be anything from education to racism to jobs, interactions with the police. We do an interview process, so we interview about 300 to 400 young people every September for 13 positions, so it's a super competitive job. But during that interview process, we do a group interview, so about 18 to 20 young people per group. And in that group, we do a lot of interactive, some similar to Hands Together, but we do a brainstorm, the issues that young people face in the Southwest neighborhood of Rochester. We do that brainstorm, have a discussion, then the 13 young people that we hire, we allow them to prioritize all those different brainstorms into the 5 areas that they want to focus on for the program year. So again, we talk about youth voice, youth leadership. It's not me as an old guy deciding what the community needs for the young people to focus on. They have that power to choose. And then also the other 250 young people that don't get the job, their words and opinions and thoughts are still represented in the work that the 13 that we hire focus on for the year. A big way that the young people spread the message of hope and unity in their communities in Rochester, Boston, and Somerville, Massachusetts is through the verbal arts. So a lot of spoken words, speeches, theatrical skits, dance, really hopefully speaking the language of young people. We organize events and have 200 to 300 young people. Myself will not be in front of the room talking to the crowd. It would be a young person doing that interactive, sharing their thoughts through the poetry and their spoken word, and really moving the complexion of the room forward. A little background information before I dig into a couple key areas around dialogue and youth voice for this conference is that Rochester, New York, we got about 500,000 people within the city limits, but the suburbs, county, country area gives us about 1 million people. But we're in the top 5 in a lot of the bad stats in the country. So we're top 5 in graduation rate. We graduate about 45% from the Rochester City School District a year. We're also in top 5 of young people living in poverty. We're also top 5 in the economic disparity between white folks and black folks. So if that gives you a little bit of background about some of the issues that we're trying to tackle with our young people, and why we feel like a program like Teen Empowerment is so important to lift up those voices and let them have those leadership roles. Get to my cards. All right, so today I'm going to focus on, we do a dialogue series that we call the Youth Police Unity Dialogue Series with the RPD, the Rochester Police Department. I'm also going to talk about the work that the youth organizers did with our local school district around solutions, not suspensions, and our work around the school to prison pipeline. And then lastly, to talk about how youth voice is very prominent in the day-to-day operation and flow of our organization. So first, I'm going to start with the dialogue series with the police. We've been doing that for about 15 years in Rochester and 18 years overall as an organization. And we really decided to pursue this just listening to young people, right? The interactions they had with officers in the community, the brutality that was going on, the lack of respect, the lack of understanding. And so this is something that Teen Empowerment believes in very strongly. We do neighborhood officers. So we do a one-day training for 6 hours with about 15 officers, just about what the dialogue entails, what to expect, what we need from them, how to be open and transparent. And then we also do about 5 days of prep work with the young people, kind of covering the same things, right? There's a little bit of nervousness and fear. I think that goes both ways when you get 13 teenagers and 15 police officers in the same room, especially when most of the police officers know some of the young people. And for sure, the young people have heard stories, rumors, and seen the interactions of some of those police officers in the community. In that dialogue over 2 days that we have the officers and young people together, we really try to dig in on respect, approach. We do a lot of interactives together. We do a thing called Human Knot, when basically everyone in the room kind of comes in, you grab a hand, as long as you don't grab the hand from the person beside you, and then we try to figure out how to get that tangle back out into a big circle. Again, for officers to touch young people and for young people to touch officers in that intimate way, when there's no drama or beef or any crime, I think is definitely a change. We also do 2 fishbowl brainstorms where we allow the young people to be in the middle and have the officers observe. We ask the young people to talk about issues that you have with police officers, and then we flip that scenario, put the officers in the middle, let the young people watch, and ask the officers the same thing, issues that you have with young people. And again, to really kind of dig in to like what goes on out in the street. The one cool thing that came out last year is a young person talked about one of his friends that got murdered about 5 years ago, a guy named Kamari Mills. He goes by Mills. And every year for his birthday, the young people in the neighborhood kind of have like a little impromptu party memorial where they all come together, show pictures, play music, and celebrate their friend. The young person talked about one officer that came early in the afternoon. He knew the young people, knew adults in the community, knew the significance of the day, and just kind of came and told the young people, as long as you guys stay on the sidewalk, you don't block any traffic, you don't get in the street, you guys can hang out, remember your friend, we got an issue. Police officer walked across the street. The young people kind of, entertained and policed themselves, got everybody back on the sidewalk. The celebration continued. About 2 hours later, another officer came by who definitely does not have a good reputation in the community. The same officer actually pulled a taser on me when I was trying to intervene in a conflict between young people. That officer is now on suspension. But he pulled up and hopped out the car, used a lot of very inappropriate words, swore at the young people, yelled at the young people, chaos ensued, young people went scrambling. And again, for that young person to tell that story about approach to the officers in that room, I think were very powerful. And also having a few officers that can challenge the other officers in the room and really say that, like, you guys can shake your heads, but you know that the stuff that the young people are talking about happens out in the community. For the last 6 years, we also been doing this with the police academy, with the recruits. So again, trying to catch them as they start their training. They're in the academy for 6 months. We catch them on the second day they're there. Then we catch them before they go out with their FTO, their field training officer, and then one time before they come back to graduate to go out into the street. And we do an evaluation, and those officers have all said that 90% of the information they hear from the young people is helpful, and that they take another 85% of the information out in the street with them before they start being police officers. We just did that recruit training about a month ago, and the thing that was sad is that there was 23 recruits. None of the 23 recruits were from Rochester. And also the 23 recruits, no one ever lived in the city. So again, to have these young people engage in dialogue, be the method of training for these officers that won't have any other opportunity to meet residents, especially young people from the city of Rochester, especially black and brown youth who they'll be policing and coming into our neighborhood. It's really that focus on what you can do to be a part of the community and not just work in one. And again, I think that becomes 10 times more real when you're hearing that from the voices of young people and not just adults in the community. Oh, thank you. Next, I talked about before, we have one of the worst graduation rates in the United States. We're graduating about 46% of our high school students in 4 years at the Rochester City School District. And even that number, if you break it down by race, I think 51% of white students graduate in 4 years. That number drops a little bit more to 44% for African American youth and about 40% for Latino youth. And so we started a campaign 2 years ago. We called Solutions, Not Suspensions, looking at the school to prison pipeline. In the year 2016, young people in our district lost the equivalent of 70,000 days due to suspension for a district of 25,000 students. And 85% of those suspensions were all for nonviolent offenses. So we're talking about wearing a hat in class, having your hood up, having your headphones in your ears. And so obviously with a 45% graduation rate and kids are missing 80,000 days of school year, It doesn't take rocket science to see the correlation between the two. So the young people worked with the mayor's office, city council, and the local school board to develop a new rubric around discipline and what was really fair and equitable for students. We worked tirelessly for 2 years, spoke at every school board meeting, had protests in front of school board meetings with loud speakers and bullhorns to really emphasize the fact that students wanted to be in class, they wanted to be in school, and really look how we could work together to bolster what was going on with the educational system. Congratulations to those young people, because last year a new code of conduct was passed that was very much supportive of students, restorative circles, really looking at holistic support for students, even changing if you get in trouble with the teacher that you're not going directly to the vice principal for discipline. You're going to a kiosk that kind of looks at, did you eat today? Is it a mental health issue? Is it a home issue? To really address the root causes and not just the behavior. And so now we see suspensions are down 55%. The GPA across our district has also risen. And hopefully this upcoming year, the projections are that the graduation rate will be around 58%. So that's a pretty big jump in a couple years. But the best part about that is that when the code of conduct got passed and teachers and administrators were meeting during late August to get ready for school, they invited teen empowerment and the youth organizers to come in and train the 500 teachers and principals and administrators on this new code of conduct. Again, to hear it from the students' mouth. And those YOs from Teen Empowerment definitely represented all the young people in the district. Again, they're kind of really put young people in leadership positions, put them at the table where youth voice would be nowhere if it wasn't for them representing for all their classmates and friends in the community. Lastly, I'm going to talk about a couple things internally at Teen Empowerment. We like to always say that young people come to us because they're needed, not because they're needy. I think really switching the narrative of looking at young people from that deficit base and really seeing their potential and power is everything that we stand for and represent. So during our hiring process for adult staff, I've been at Teen Empowerment for 6 years. My interview for the final was myself, the young woman that was in the finals with me, 10 young people from Teen Empowerment, and about 4 staff. We did a group, because we do all our work in a group, and at the end of that interview for me, the young people had a 50% vote on who the adult staff was going to be that got to work there. I knew right there that this was the place I was meant to work, that youth voice is so important and so meaningful in this agency. And I often think to the students that are in the room or any teachers here, if young people had that type of say in what teachers worked in their schools, curriculum, principles, policy, to think about the engagement and how all those standards of education that we measure would be different if young people really had a stake and really had a place at the table to really talk about what goes on in their schools. Lastly, I'll talk about the youth organizers. So it is a paid position, like I said before. They all signed a behavior management contract. That's just really about accountability. It lays out all the things that could potentially get you in trouble at Teen Empowerment. Everything from not being motivated at work to a no-call, no-show, showing up to work late, violence in the community, which you post on Facebook. And so every category in the contract has a number of steps that you can reach before you get fired. So say if you're late 4 times, the 4th time you're late, you get fired. But we do have a rehiring process. So the young people have 48 hours where they can let staff know that they would like to get their job back. If they say that, we say, cool, come on in. They sit in front of their group members and they have to prepare a speech, a poem, a spoken word that directly addresses what what they got fired for. Then their coworkers get to put them in the firing squad. We call it the hot seat. All the young people get to then ask questions to that person that got fired about what they wrote, what they witness every day in group. And then again, the young people get a 50% vote on whether that young person could rejoin the group. So really putting that accountability, that leadership, and really trying to find ways to enhance youth jobs, and especially youth meaningful and leadership jobs in Rochester, where young people really feel like they can be a part of the solution, where a lot of times they're always just looked at as the problem. So I think that's pretty much all I got, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Delilah Garvin, and y'all don't know how much I was sweating up here and nervous, shaking my leg. But overall, I'm sorry, I haven't spoken in front of so many people before. I'm pretty much, thank you. So being one of 8 and growing up in a family that isn't really for you, having siblings having siblings in basically the system and seeing it, growing up with it, it's kind of hard. Like, this is a great opportunity. I would never see myself here speaking on such topics. I can say being an introvert and isolating myself from people always got people judging me based off of my appearance, one, and how I carry myself. The fact that I like education, I go to school to be better, be the difference within my community. It's hard for me to express myself when it comes to topics such as this, because it's like I see it throughout my day, every day, and having people against you your whole life, but no matter what, overcoming the boundaries that people set for you, going through challenges, facing those, and basically just being a bright student and all. Social media has played a very different role in my life, because I don't post as much as I used to, I guess, because people are very judgmental and things are said to affect people's input. Yes, you have people that are for you, but then again, you have people that are against you. So being here and talking about identity and who I am, it's more of who you want to be and who you grow to be. I can say I've grown so much over the past year, not just because of my job and what people think of me, but I've grown for myself, not just to settle for less. I've seen, with the social justice part, I've seen my dad, I used to play basketball, so we were running around the track. It was about 8 o'clock at night and dark. It was pretty dark, and I was running around the track, and I seen my dad get pulled over because simply the fact of he was watching us. He was accused of somebody made a complaint about him, I guess. I don't know what happened, but he was arrested. My dad is on disability, so he has bad knees. And the fact that he got handcuffed and seeing that, holding my little sister so she wasn't cry, bending down so no shots was fired, seeing my little brother cry in my hands, like that, it's it's hurt. It's hurt. And the fact that, like, going through them challenges and seeing, like, you guys all here united for literally hearing our voice and hearing what we have to say, it's a blessing, because other teams don't get this opportunity. And I'm blessed to say I'm here speaking on topics that I've been through throughout my life and things that changed me for the better. And I plan to go to college, first generation. Nobody. Thank you. Nobody in my family has ever been to college, let alone barely graduated high school. So for me to be getting the grades that I do have after being raised by my father, not my mother, and just being there and seeing, like, it's so much more to life. And this is a great opportunity, and I thank everyone here, and thank you.
All right, so we still are going to take our full 15 minutes for Q&A, so I hope that folks have been jotting down some questions. They can be for the whole panel, or they can be for one or two folks in particular, so I want to just go ahead and kind of open it up to the group. We do have mics, so if you raise your hand, somebody will come over to you with a mic.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Tolan. I'm here at UVA. So I had two questions for the panel, and then maybe for the larger group at some point, about structuring the conversation here. And the first one is, the first speaker mentioned two concepts I thought we might try to understand a little better. The first was, he said the other side could have principled positions. And really, I wonder how and who gets to decide what's principled position, and what are the principles by which you decide a principled position. I don't want to get too abstract, but I just thought about that, of isn't a lot of it what gets decided to be principled, and what's considered illegitimate reasons for holding a position. And I think that's very important as we start to talk about voice of youth and thinking about the future in particular. The second comment is, also about taking off from the first speaker, is using the term dialogue. And like you, I come from a large family, and we have sort of two bits of advice we give people who are new to one of our dinners or one of our group gatherings. The first is jump in, because otherwise you won't be heard. And then the second is don't expect to be able to finish a sentence or that the conversation is going to flow. You need to kind of be in this conversation where there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions. And I'm not wanting to get too nitpicky again, but if we're not really dialoguing, if what we're doing is we're engaging in spits and spurts of conversation with a very diverse group of people who are commenting about different things from different perspectives, how might that affect the way we think about our interest in trying to come to some resolution? And maybe for the next couple of days, how do we want to think about that?
All right, I'm gonna restate just so that the panelists who aren't here can hear, but I want to make sure, I don't know if I fully understood the second question. So the first question, and Nick, you had mentioned in your presentation the idea that, you know, in some situations, not in all, both sides may have a principled position. And so Patrick Tolan here at UVA was wondering who kind of gets to decide, or how are those determinations made? And in particular, we want to think about that a little bit more in the context of youth voice, and maybe you're thinking a little bit about like adultism or kind of other tendencies that we have as adults to discount or dismiss youth voice. I was thinking about that as well. Maybe that's a question for Nick and Shawn, just about how we think about dealing with power. And I think that's both true in terms of age, but especially when we're talking about, Shawn, you talked a lot about these dialogues with police, and so I was kind of thinking, what can we do in advance if we have decided that a dialogue is a good opportunity to kind of manage that and think about amplifying youth voice and dealing with that power dynamic within the room. So maybe we'll just start with that, and then we could move to the second question. Does that?
Sure. Thank you for that, and thank you for the question, Patrick. I did hear both questions. I'm going to address the second one first and briefly. I think dialogue, I don't deal with dialogue as a kind of ideal. I deal with dialogue as a human aspiration, as a human practice that we try to attain. But as you said, in many cases, partial, incomplete, imperfect dialogue is what we actually have. I'm a philosopher, but I don't believe in idealizing these issues. The first issue, I think, touches on not only my presentation, but the others as well. I think we have to start from the assumption of power imbalances in many contexts of dialogue. It's one of those contextual factors I think we have to be aware of and even critical of in the context of the dialogue. So when you say whose principles get established, I think that's often exactly one of the things that we're actually engaging over. In situations of unequal power, sometimes one group is saying our principles are the principles that are going to govern at a kind of meta level how we talk and what we talk about. But those very principles might be sometimes what is at dispute, especially again in context of power. And so making those principles and problematizing them and questioning them within the dialogue is itself, I think, one of these bootstrapping efforts that sometimes we have to establish through dialogue what the ground rules and principles are that we're going to be actually applying to ourselves and to one another. It can't be unilateral. It can't be top down. And I think that Shawn's example of community police dialogues is a great example of this, because you do have a situation where there's laws and there's obviously institutions of the state that create imbalances, especially with young people. And acknowledging that young people do have a point of view, do have reasons for their views, even when they're young and developing and incomplete, I think is a gesture of respect and trust that has to be extended towards young people if we're going to have a dialogue at all.
And I think one way we try to even that playing field is that we make the dialogues very much TE. So at least from the young people standpoint, doing a warm-up question, doing interactives, doing concentric conversations, which is like a exercise. It's kind of like speed dating, where we kind of allow you to talk to a different person for 2 minutes and kind of rotate until you talk to everybody in the room. They feel very strong and familiar in those places. And I think the principle comes from us because we're the ones initiating the dialogue. And the adult staff, definitely police, I guess a bad word, but definitely are there to kind of facilitate and make sure that the dialogue is fair and balanced. And last year, the 2 days went pretty smooth. We dug in, emotions were in the room, but in the last 40 minutes before we ended the second day, the idea of white privilege came up. And obviously when you had, out of the 15 officers, I think 9 were white, and 2 of the folks grew up in our neighborhood. So again, their idea of white privilege was different because they grew up in the neighborhood they're policing. But I think to kind of explain what privilege is, white supremacy, and how that plays out, and to put that on the table, we didn't leave, as Nick talked about in the beginning, in a kumbaya moment, but it also pushed both those officers to get more engaged. They came around TE, sat in more groups. We gave them a couple books that really kind of talked about white privilege and white supremacy, and didn't really even talk about the policing. So I think it's just really to, in our situation, do whatever we can to protect the young people. We do it in agenda design. So in that agenda, we make sure that everything's fair and balanced, and that both sides get to be represented fully, and get to be represented with little to no interference to kind of cops can butt in on the young people. So we just work that out in the design of the agenda.
I also have something to say. I think like being youth and being involved in like different community activities, we're viewed as belittled. We're belittled because yes, we're young-minded, but like in my community at least, it's like we have the most to say, but don't get the chance to say it. And it's like when we get that opportunity, we get nervous, we get scared, so we can't really put our viewpoint out there. And for like teachers, you'll get like probably one good teacher out of your whole high school experience. And that one teacher sticks with you. We all been 17, a teen, 18 at one point, and what we fail to realize is like, you've been that way, you've been a teen once, so you know how teens are. But instead of pushing greatness on them, you belittle them or say, oh, you're less worthy of doing something simply because they're young-minded. They haven't reached that point in life where, oh, I know what to do, I know what to say, good from bad. And if we just get that opportunity and to say, like, stand up for ourselves and speak like how I am today, we will be more successful, and we won't have to be having these conversations about how to empower youth, because it's like it will already be instilled in us. So, yeah.
Johari?
Hello. I guess my question is for the panel, and we're kind of in a time where we know dialogue is important, particularly for democracy, but we're also in this like cancel culture, and the reality is, considering who you're dialoguing with, like what does the panel think about the worth of dialogue? Are there certain spaces, or there certain dialogues that shouldn't happen? So as a Black woman, is it meaningful to me to dialogue with a Klansman? You know, so like thinking about these like larger structural issues, these larger power issues, especially with the police and youth, you know, the type of harm that may bring the youth to dialogue with police who, you know, we know the kind of structural historic processes in place. So anybody on the panel who kind of wants to speak to like, are there times that dialogue shouldn't be used, so to speak?
And Nick and Gabe, were you able to hear that question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Silent.
Gabriel, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll say, I mean, I think that's a fascinating question, and one that's particularly salient for not only our sort of society more generally, but, you know, as we think about universities, and I was actually coming from the University of Chicago, and it strikes me too as these questions of kind of free speech, right? An idea that is any perspective sort of one that we should engage with or allowed to be out there in the public space. And I think it's, you know, it speaks to a very deep question about how we consider our democracy and consider engaging with pluralistic voices. And I think some of what Nick laid out was really interesting to me because there is so much complexity in dialogue. And I think the ways you think about structuring that, the ways you think about providing space to address it can also help in that. And so maybe it's not that, you know, everything needs to be engaged with in a certain way, but that we need to be really thoughtful about how we do engage with certain problematic discourses or also problematic perspectives. And so framing them in like, let's talk about this not just as this idea that someone has and they have the right to voice, but how this is connected to historical injustices, to issues of intersectionality, and making that sort of clear, I think, as well, because I think that ignoring it, or not ignoring it, but sort of not engaging with it, also can have really problematic consequences, you know, and I think as we think about youth and their development, we also we have sort of, I think, a responsibility to foster that kind of engagement with it so that we're not pretending like it's not there. And I'm not saying that's necessarily where you're going with it, but I think that can be sort of maybe one approach. But Nick, I'm curious to hear what you think too in terms of structuring dialogues, and particularly with problematic discourses.
Sure, absolutely. I'll try to be brief. I think one of the nice insights in Shawn's presentation is sometimes you have to do a lot of preparation before the dialogue happens in order for the dialogue even to be possible. You can't just put people in a room and say, okay, begin to dialogue. I think one of the problems with what I'll call idealized conceptions of dialogue is people say things like, well, the solution to when dialogue is difficult is more dialogue. And I think that the reality is that there are times when it's a difficult, pragmatic, situated choice to say, when do we have to break off the dialogue? This is not going anywhere. And at least in the short term, dialogue is not possible. I think we have to be realistic about that, and we can't think that more dialogue is always going to solve the problem. I think that's not realistic. Having said that, at least in my conception, dialogue is an essential component of a pluralistic democracy. We can't give up on the possibility of dialogue with those people, whoever those people are, permanently. And so even when we break off dialogue, we have to break off dialogue in the short term because it's just not working and it's actually heightening and exacerbating tensions. Breaking off dialogue in the short term is still a way of hoping to create the conditions in the future for a possible dialogue. And at least, I mean, call me an idealist, I suppose, but I don't want to give up in pluralist democracy the value of dialogue across differences entirely. I think that would be detrimental to democracy. And as I've said in my presentation, I fear that we are moving in that direction as a society more and more right now. And I think that's not good for democracy.
I think I want to push to a point in dialogue where, again, never want anyone to be hurt or to lose hope based on the dialogue. But I do feel like in most times it's like a group in power and one that's more powerless. And I feel like having those uncomfortable conversations is, I really believe, how like progress is made, but never at the expense of anyone's feelings. And so you gave the example of like being a black woman and talking to like the Klan. And I guess as a black man, I've gotten tired of trying to like make race okay for white people. So in that conversation, I wouldn't want to play. But in the conversation of youth and police officers, I think that's different. So I think it's just really about like the individual dialogue. But of course, if anyone's going to feel any pain or any regression or any trauma that's re-triggered by that dialogue, then obviously that's one that probably shouldn't happen.
Okay. In my opinion, it's more of how you conversate with people, how you communicate with others. Like, it's always a right and a wrong to say certain topics on certain things. People do get offensive, but being able to be like better and like trying to reason with others' opinions instead of trying to down them or judge them because of how they think. Some people lack knowledge in certain things. So therefore, you all have to like have an open mindset and just be able to take into account how others may feel and be able to talk to them and say that you may feel this type of way, but in my opinion, I feel like this is better off. And we're going agree to disagree, basically. And dialogue is like, it's just how you communicate at the end of the day. You can either say it wrong and live with it, or just not say anything at all.
So I think what I'm taking away from this panel is intentionality. It sounds like both in terms of just opting even into that dialogue in the first place, but also thinking about establishing ground rules and being really intentional about maintaining those throughout, given that there are all of these challenges that present. So I want you to, we're just in the interest of time and needing to move forward, I want you to join me in thanking this panel. We will pass it over to the second panel now. Thank you.
And we will. So in the interest of time, luckily the first artistic performance was actually a video. So we will push that and we will show that video at the end of lunch to bring us back together after lunch. So right now we're going to take a 10-minute break and we'll come back together at 11 for the next panel. So thank you. Please refresh yourselves.